Welcome to the program. I'm Andrew Wilkow. You know, there's nothing like trying to rekindle a movement of overindulged, $5 coffee swilling, iPad and iPhone toting wannabe revolutionaries who thought the way to stick it to the man was to stink up a park for a few months. And they were totally committed until it got cold outside. I took these pictures personally at Occupy last fall. Yeah, I was there, and it smelled bad. Now, today was supposed to be all about recreating this with a second round of protests and demonstrations. Here in New York City, last night, left-wing activists gathered to celebrate the one-year anniversary. You know, they started it with an army of Che shirts and a call to end to greed, and they willingly accepted gazillionaire celebrities who whisked into their demonstrations from their limos, like the uber-rich Def Jam co-founder Russell Simmons and filmmaker Michael Moore, as well as Rage Against the Machine guitarist Tom Morello.
Fall right here. But I'll stand or fall right here. In my country. In my country. In my home. In my home. I used to think that I was alone. I used to think that I'm alone. I ain't alone no more. I ain't alone no more.
Yeah, Sony 550 Records and Viacom's MTV and Clear Channel venues and Merchant Hot Topic. He's so against the machine. I'm sure Tom's going to be falling real hard with them. You know, the quote-unquote 99%ers. Didn't seem to mind when the celebrities stopped by to hog the spotlight, and I'm sure these 1%ers are right in line with their fight for income equality. The occupiers, many of whom are too ignorant to understand what it is they're cozying up to, dream of some kind of totalitarian utopian state. It all sounds so romantic. Take down the big evil banks, forgive the debt, spread the wealth around, and everything will be fine. That is somewhere between naive and moronic. First of all, most of what they were complaining about started with big government failures. As the government grows, it consumes more capital from the private sector. Then the costs associated with government get passed on to the whole of society. Not to mention that government can only grow at the expense of liberty. What many of these little wannabe spoiled brats and leftover hippies didn't seem to understand was that most of the banks got in trouble because of the federal regulations. When a bank is coerced into making loans that no banker in his right mind would ever make, the bank is forced into risk. And then the bank takes losses due to the loans they were forced to make. When that happens, they seek to make up the difference or lose the confidence of their account and shareholders. That either comes in the form of taking the bailout money or attempting to profit from even riskier avenues like derivative markets. Add in the fact that the government is so intertwined in the banking system that the path to the top of the banking system includes doing the government's bidding. We call that corporatism. But why kill the buzz? One of the demands of Occupy was forgiving student debt. Translation, don't treat me like a grown-up. If you want to see how much of a person, a person could be, treat them like an adult. You took the loan, you have to pay it back. Now, where did the occupiers get the idea that going to college was a right? Oh, from their professors. The notion that college should be free of charge is an affront to the discipline of failure. I mean, why address the cost of college versus the future earning potential of the student? I mean, hey, study whatever you want. Somebody else is going to pay the bill. You know, the problem is that society doesn't need 1 million graduates with doctorate degrees in art history. Why? Because there aren't enough jobs to support that many art history majors. Democrats have also expressed that tuition costs are getting out of control. But what actually is driving up college costs? How much does a tenured professor get paid? What about the environmentalists driving up the cost of paper? What does it cost to make a textbook? How about every time students walk out to protest the wages of campus employees? That has an effect. You know, banks have very little to do with what colleges actually charge to attend. Like all wannabes, they've convinced themselves they're doing something totally unique here. Not really. There was actually an Occupy Wall Street movement in 1979.
Nuclear power is organized crime. That's what it's all about. They're killing the earth and all the creatures that are on it.
You're protecting the right of the financial community to keep supporting the nuclear industry. You're protecting the nuclear industry. That's what we're against.
That went nowhere fast. What was funny was to watch as almost instantly their little utopia fell apart. As Occupy raised hundreds of thousands of dollars, members of the so-called Finance Committee began to act like any socialist bureaucracy. They stopped following the communal rules. New York Magazine reported there was a backlash against the finance team for killing proposals the occupiers were in favor of. One of the group's finance guys, Jim McGarvey, was quoted as saying, and I quote, "Throw money at idiot things? I don't think so." You mean they voted how to spend the money that they didn't really work to get that was donated, and a group of unelected, unaccountable people decided otherwise? The funny thing about the Finance Committee is they arose as the sort of aristocrats of the Occupy movement and began to treat themselves to the largesse that socialist leaders throughout history have enjoyed. Almost immediately, the occupiers felt the effects of big government on a small scale. That same guy, Jim McGarvey, that I just told you about, he justified his behavior by saying, quote, "We're leading by example. We have to be above everything." And he meant that literally. So-called financial gurus were busted for sleeping in rooms at the highbrow W Hotel, where their rooms were a whopping $700 a night. Meanwhile, the common occupiers were slumming it downtown, sleeping outside in tarps and refusing to shower. Believe me, I was there, and I remember the smell. Now, they wanted an end to greed, and they wanted resources owned by the people. Yet the funniest part was watching them try on emphasize this concept of utopia, only to find out that some people sleep under tarps while other occupiers sleep in $700 a night hotel suites. But there was something tragic about this movement. Watching how this utopia full of hippies and college kids responded to crime, we saw the extremely violent elements of their so-called peaceful movement from the criminal element that was attracted to the Occupy camps. The media was forced, and I use that word force, to report on rape, robbery, and even murder, to the mass destruction of public and private property. There was also baiting police officers into violent confrontations. There were 7,000 documented arrests in 114 cities across the U.S. So much for their peaceful movement. Doug Schoen, a Democratic pollster, not exactly a conservative, found that 31% of the movement supported using violence to advance their agenda, whatever their agenda may be.